Tanks speed the advance as a Polish town is about to fall.
Germany had for years laid claim to parts of Poland's territory.
When the Second World War broke out in Europe, Patton observed from a distance the rapid destruction of Poland and later the collapse of France in 1940. Reports on the German Blitzkrieg confirmed what he had suspected for years. By combining mobility, surprise, and decisive command, an army could overwhelm enemies that were numerically superior. The figure of the German generals began to take on a particular prominence for him. He did not yet know their names precisely, but he understood that behind every panzer advance there were officers trained in a rigorous operational tradition, capable of exploiting every mistake made by the adversary. His respect was grounded in this idea of cold, efficient professionalism, which contrasted with the indecision and doctrinal dispersion he perceived among many Allied commanders. After Pearl Harbor and the entry of the United States into the war, Patton finally obtained the opportunity to put his own ideas to the test in a major theater of operations. In November 1942, he was appointed to command the Western Task Force in Operation Torch, the Allied landing in North Africa. His troops were to occupy the coasts of Morocco, then under the control of the Vichy government, while British and American forces attacked Algeria. Although the immediate main adversary consisted of French units, Patton knew that behind this initial clash stood the real rival, the German Afrika Korps, with its reputation as an elite army forged in combat against the British in Cyrenaica. The name of Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was already circulating among Allied officers as a synonym for an audacious and creative general. Patton, who had studied military campaigns and memoirs for decades, was familiar with Rommel's career in the First World War and was aware of his book on infantry tactics. He saw in him the modern embodiment of the great captains he admired, a man who combined initiative in the field with a keen understanding of the moral effect of surprise and speed. Although the regime he served was repulsive to him, the professional performance of Rommel and other German commanders in Africa seemed worthy of recognition. The initial phase of Torch tested Patton's ability to coordinate complex amphibious operations. The landings at Casablanca and other points along the Moroccan coast unfolded amid irregular resistance and political negotiations, with acceptable results but far from perfection. For him, however, what mattered most was that the American army gained experience in combined operations and moved closer to the sector of the front where the Germans were fighting. He saw North Africa as a harsh school in which his men would have to learn, through costly mistakes, how to confront the type of enemy against whom it was worth measuring the worth of an army. The most severe clash between American and German forces did not occur under his direct command, but rather in February 1943 at the Casarine Pass, when the U.S. Second Corps was surprised and overwhelmed by an offensive directed by Rommel and other Axis commanders. The lack of experience, deficiencies in command, and the dispersion of American units resulted in a disordered retreat. From a distance, Patton interpreted that defeat as a brutal confirmation of the difference in level between an army that was still green and an adversary that knew how to exploit every weakness. For him, the main responsibility did not lie in the individual bravery of the soldier, but in the quality of command. Shortly after Casarine, Patton was called upon to assume command of the Second Corps. He arrived in Tunisia with the explicit mission of restoring discipline, reorganizing the chain of command, and turning a demoralized force into an offensive instrument. His style was immediate and forceful. He tightened discipline, imposed strict uniform regulations, demanded absolute punctuality in movements, and harshly punished any sign of disorder. To many, this seemed like excessive formalism on an active front. But Patton saw in these details the psychological foundation of an army capable of sustaining clashes with an adversary as organized as the German one. In his orders and conversations, he frequently referred to the need to match the enemy in professionalism. It was not enough to have more equipment or a more powerful economy. It was essential that officers and soldiers internalize an aggressive combat ethic based on initiative and confidence in their own ability to maneuver under fire. Patton admired precisely this in the Nazi commanders, the ability to make rapid decisions under conditions of uncertainty, relying on coherent doctrinal training and on a system that delegated tactical authority downward. His declared objective was to transform the Second Corps into a force that, when facing the Germans, would not merely resist, but would be capable of imposing the tempo of the battle. The tests did not take long to arrive. At the Battle of El Gueta in March 1943, American units under Patton's command faced German armored forces. Although the tactical situation differed from the great desert battles fought by Rommel against the British, the engagement held strong symbolic value for Patton. His troops managed to withstand the armored attacks and inflict significant losses on the enemy forces. In his eyes, this result demonstrated that, with proper leadership and restored morale, the American soldier was perfectly capable of fighting on equal terms against the most renowned divisions of the Axis. Throughout the Tunisian campaign, Patton closely followed the movements of the Afrika Korps and the auxiliary German units. He analyzed their deployments, their attempts at counterattacks, and the way they organized orderly withdrawals to gain time. Although he considered the German strategic situation increasingly difficult, he never ceased to emphasize the skill of their generals in making the most of limited resources. This assessment reinforced his belief that the quality of command could at least partially compensate for material inferiority, provided that discipline, flexibility, and a sense of maneuver were maintained. Patton's professional respect for the Nazi generals did not mean ignoring the mistakes he also observed. He noted, for example, that obedience to political orders from Berlin often forced German commanders to hold untenable positions or to launch offensives with little chance of success. Yet even in such cases, he was impressed by the tactical ability of the commanders to improvise defenses, organize re-embarkations, or concentrate forces at critical points. In his analysis, the difference between German command and that of many allies lay not only in doctrine, but in the willingness to assume calculated risks and to accept short-term losses in order to achieve operational advantages. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 represented for Patton the opportunity to carry the experience gained in North Africa into a European campaign of greater political and operational complexity. In command of the US 7th Army, he was to land in the western part of the island, while Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army did so in the eastern sector. On paper, coordination between the two commands was essential to envelop Axis forces and secure a rapid conquest. In practice, personal rivalry and doctrinal differences between Patton and Montgomery marked the entire operation. Patton believed that war had to be waged with audacity and speed, exploiting every opportunity to outflank the enemy. Montgomery, by contrast, tended to plan more methodical operations, supported by a careful accumulation of resources. From the beginning of the campaign, the British advance toward Messina was slowed by German resistance and by difficult terrain, while Patton sought alternative routes to accelerate the fall of the island. In this context, the performance of the German command in Sicily drew his attention in a particular way. Unlike many Italian units, which displayed wavering morale and at times disintegrated under Allied pressure, the German forces deployed on the island maintained remarkable cohesion. Under the coordination of commanders such as Albert Kesselring and the generals leading the armored and infantry divisions, the Germans organized a flexible defense based on delaying positions, local counterattacks, and effective use of the terrain. For Patton, accustomed to judging the quality of an army by its behavior in retreat as much as by its offensive performance, the way in which the German command yielded ground without losing order constituted further evidence of its professional competence. As the 7th Army consolidated its beachheads and advanced inland, Patton began to carry out maneuvers that went beyond the original plans. He took Palermo, the capital of western Sicily, with a speed that surprised even his allies. This advance not only had propaganda value, but also forced German commanders to reconfigure their lines and rethink their withdrawal routes toward the northeast. Patton observed how, despite constant Allied pressure and the progressive collapse of the Italian military structure, German units continued to execute orderly maneuvers, pulling back toward more defensible lines and using time to organize evacuation to the mainland. The comparison between the behavior of Italians and Germans reinforced a conviction that had been forming since the Great War. Not all armies possess the same professional culture. Patton saw in German command an insistence on rigorous training, clarity of orders, and the initiative of subordinate commanders that he rarely found among other combatants. Even when he criticized the subordination of those generals to a political regime he despised, he continued to emphasize in his comments and diaries the level of effectiveness they displayed under increasingly adverse strategic conditions. The rivalry with Montgomery sharpened that contrast in his mind. While the British insisted on a main axis of advance along the eastern coast, colliding head-on with German defenses around Mount Etna, Patton opted for a series of fan-shaped advances, using secondary routes and exploiting the mobility of his motorized forces. This approach reflected his conviction that the best way to confront an enemy with competent commanders was to multiply threats, forcing it to disperse resources and respond at a tempo imposed from the outside. In a certain sense, he admired the fact that German forces continued to achieve significant delays despite being subjected to pressure from two Allied fronts. Nevertheless, the Sicilian campaign also exposed the darker sides of Patton's character. Incidents such as the slapping of soldiers hospitalized for exhaustion or combat trauma revealed an intransigent and brutal side of his concept of duty. For him, the ideal soldier was expected to endure fear and fatigue with the same hardness with which German officers had withstood extreme situations on the Eastern Front or in North Africa. That standard, which he considered applicable to all, initially prevented him from understanding the nature of psychological trauma in war. The negative reaction of public opinion and of the US High Command after the incident became known undermined his political position, though not his strictly military prestige. While the German commanders, aware of the impossibility of holding the island indefinitely, organized a massive evacuation of troops and equipment to Calabria, Patton followed the operation with interest. Despite Allied air and naval superiority, tens of thousands of German soldiers managed to cross the Strait of Messina. For an observer like him, this orderly retreat under fire confirmed the planning and control capabilities of the German High Command. It was not a chaotic withdrawal, but a calculated maneuver to preserve the professional core of an army that would continue fighting in Italy and later on other fronts. The final capture of Messina in August 1943 closed the Sicilian campaign. The British and Americans arrived almost simultaneously in the city, fueling the prestige rivalry between Montgomery and Patton. The latter considered that his maneuvers had been bolder and faster than those of the British ally, and that his offensive style more closely resembled that of the best German generals he had long studied. In his assessment, modern warfare rewarded commanders who dared to take calculated risks, exploit fleeting opportunities, and move quickly before the enemy could reorganize. After the Sicilian campaign, Patton was temporarily removed from the operational forefront due to the slapping scandal. The decision was driven both by political considerations and the need to preserve the public image of the US Army. For him, this pause was a humiliation, but also an opportunity to reflect on what had happened and to continue analyzing the behavior of his German adversaries on other fronts. He continued studying intelligence reports and summaries on operations in Italy and on the Eastern Front, reinforcing his perception that German command, even in retreat, maintained a professional coherence that distinguished it. Patton's reputation as an aggressive and effective commander, however, did not disappear. Within the Allied High Command, he was still seen as a high-powered asset that, if used well, could play a decisive role in future operations. The need to plan a large-scale landing in France brought his name back to the center of debate. Based on his experience in Africa and Sicily, and on his understanding of how German generals thought and reacted, planners considered that he could play a key role in the strategic deception preceding the invasion of Northwest Europe and later in the exploitation operations after the landing. In the United Kingdom, at the beginning of 1944, Patton became a central figure in a carefully designed strategic deception operation. While the Allied High Command prepared the Normandy landing, intelligence services relied on Patton's reputation as an aggressive commander to influence German assessments. He was therefore assigned nominal command of a supposed 1st US Army Group, a largely fictitious formation deployed in southeastern England, facing the Strait of Dover. The Germans, following their own reports and prejudices, considered it logical that the most offensive American general would lead the main invasion strike, and concentrated their expectations on a potential landing in the Calais region. Patton knew that his mere presence was being used as a decoy and understood that his fame among the Germans was an operational resource. For a man accustomed to measuring the value of generals by their ability to influence the battlefield, it was significant that the German general staff perceived him as the most dangerous adversary. In a way, this external evaluation reinforced his respect for German officers because it implied that they were capable of clearly identifying what kind of commander represented a real threat. German intelligence, interpreting deliberately manipulated signals, continued to attribute command of the supposed army group to Patton, even after the real Normandy landing. On June 6, 1944, while Allied troops landed on the Normandy beaches, Patton did not participate directly in the initial assault. His main role during those first weeks was to maintain the illusion that the main effort was still to come, supposedly under his command, in another area of the French coast. Only when the Normandy beachheads were firmly secured in late July was the Third Army officially activated under his command. From that moment on, Patton transitioned from being a decoy to becoming one of the main instruments of the Allied exploitation of the land success. The Third Army entered combat as part of Operation Cobra, the offensive aimed at breaking the German front in the western sector of Normandy. After a massive aerial bombardment, German defenses became disorganized, and Patton was tasked with penetrating the gap and exploiting the breach with maximum dynamism. For him, this was precisely the type of situation in which the value of a commander was measured: a still dangerous but disoriented enemy, and an operational space open for deep maneuvers. He knew that on the other side of the line there was a corps of officers trained to react quickly, concentrate reserves, and organize counterattacks. His goal was to move faster than the German command could think. As his armored and infantry divisions advanced through the interior of France, Patton insisted on maintaining a pace that would surprise the enemy. He ordered long marches, unexpected turns, and attacks on the flanks of withdrawing German formations. Intelligence reports indicated that German commanders were experiencing serious difficulties in stabilizing a coherent line, not due to a lack of technical ability, but because of the constant pressure applied to their strongpoints. In his comments, Patton emphasized that German soldiers continued to fight with discipline and that many of their generals were still attempting to maneuver skillfully, even when the strategic situation became increasingly unfavorable. The partial encirclement of German forces in the Falaise pocket illustrated this tension well. While the Allies sought to close the ring, the German command attempted to organize an orderly withdrawal to the east, combining diversionary attacks and desperate efforts to keep corridors open. Patton observed how, despite the chaos and losses, German coordination capacity did not completely disintegrate. This resistance confirmed to him that he was facing an adversary whose professional competence had not been destroyed by accumulated defeats. In his assessment, this quality increased the merit of every advance achieved by his own troops. After Falaise, the German front in France collapsed, opening the way to the Seine and beyond. The Third Army carried out one of the fastest offensives of the war on the Western Front. In a matter of weeks, Patton led his forces across vast areas of France, liberating cities and crossing rivers at a speed that often exceeded logistical plans. The advance relied on the combination of motorized columns, aggressive reconnaissance, and operational decisions made quickly. Patton saw in this form of warfare a mirror of the best German campaigns of 1939 to 1941, but now executed from the Allied side. In his observations, he repeatedly noted the tactical quality of the enemy. As he crossed certain regions, he encountered improvised but well-chosen defensive positions, rearguard ambushes, and local counterattacks that, while insufficient to stop the overall advance, demonstrated that German commanders continued to apply solid principles in the use of terrain and time. For Patton, the fact that an army in retreat continued to fight with such coherence was further proof of the strength of its professional tradition. He repeated to his subordinates that they must not underestimate the adversary, precisely because mistakes made against a competent command were quickly punished. During this period, he expressed in conversations and writings his conviction that the German soldier was, as a combatant, the best they had faced. He was not referring only to individual bravery, but to the combination of discipline, training, and the ability to sustain complex defensive actions. He extended this assessment to many of their generals, whom he saw as products of a military school that, since the Prussian era, had been characterized by rigorous training and a demand for the study of historical campaigns. This admiration did not imply ignoring these commanders' obedience to a criminal regime, but Patton tended to separate in his analysis the technical quality of the officer from the political responsibility of the state he served. The speed of the Third Army's advance, however, created new problems. Supply lines stretched to the limit. The capacity of ports and the road network to sustain the flow of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts proved insufficient. Patton insisted that while the enemy was retreating in relative disorder, it was the moment to push the movement to the maximum, without giving them time to reorganize on the German border. But the Allied High Command had to distribute resources among several army groups, and logistical priorities did not always align with his operational desires. Despite these constraints, the Third Army managed to cross the Moselle River and approach the Saar line, entering territory considered German. At this stage, German resistance became more stubborn, supported by fortifications and a detailed knowledge of the terrain. Patton continued to recognize in his adversaries' traits he considered characteristic of the best generals: improvisational ability, intelligent use of local reserves, and use of natural and artificial obstacles to multiply defensive effectiveness. The difference was that now these resources were being applied from a clearly inferior strategic position. The German offensive in the Ardennes, launched in December 1944, surprised the Allied High Command by its scale, but not Patton in terms of the spirit driving it. From his position at the head of the Third Army, he had insisted that the adversary was still capable of bold maneuvers, even in a situation of strategic inferiority. When German forces broke into the lightly defended sector of the US front, creating a deep wedge to the west, Patton interpreted the attack as yet another demonstration of the offensive character of German generals, who preferred to risk a decisive gamble rather than resign themselves to a slow and purely defensive retreat. On December 19, 1944, a famous conference was held in Verdun, where Dwight D. Eisenhower gathered the main Allied commanders of the Western Front. As the situation was analyzed and possible responses debated, Patton stated that he could turn a significant portion of the Third Army northward in a very short time to relieve the threatened sector, particularly the city of Bastogne, where US units were surrounded. His proposal surprised because of the promised speed. He had already ordered his staff to prepare turning plans in different directions in the event of a German offensive, precisely because he considered it likely that the enemy would attempt a quick strike in a sector considered secondary. The maneuver that followed became one of the most talked about movements of the war. Over icy, congested roads, units of the Third Army turned almost 90 degrees from their original axis in Lorraine to head north. The coordination of marches, supply, and communications required considerable command and organizational effort. Patton saw in this operation a way to demonstrate that the US Army could respond with flexibility and speed comparable to what he had admired in the German Blitzkrieg campaigns of the early years of the war. Meanwhile, the German offensive, led by commanders such as Hasso von Manteuffel and Sepp Dietrich, under the supervision of senior leaders like Gerd von Rundstedt, showed both the capability and limitations of the German High Command. Patton recognized that the choice of terrain followed a logic of surprise and concealment, exploiting a sector of the front considered unlikely for a major offensive. However, he also observed that the operation depended on rapid success and the capture of key bridges, which, in case of delays, made it vulnerable to well-coordinated counterattacks. The arrival of the Third Army units in the vicinity of Bastogne in the last days of December was the result of that turning maneuver. The city, defended mainly by the 101st Airborne Division and other US elements, had withstood the German siege despite heavy bombardment and adverse weather conditions. Patton ordered continued attacks to open a corridor to the garrison. On December 26th, elements of the Third Army made contact with the surrounded forces, restoring ground communication. For Patton, this operation confirmed that the combination of advance planning, decisive command, and mobility could neutralize even an offensive conceived by experienced German generals. In his subsequent assessments, Patton acknowledged that the enemy had once again demonstrated considerable tactical competence. The attacks on Bastogne, the use of terrain to channel Allied movements, and the efforts to exploit the initial confusion reflected, in his view, the same professional tradition he had been observing since the beginning of the war. However, he also emphasized the negative effects of Adolf Hitler's political interference in the conduct of the campaign, overly ambitious objectives, underestimation of German logistical capacity, and rigidity in plan execution contributed to the final failure of the offensive. After the stabilization of the Ardennes front and the German withdrawal, the Third Army resumed its advance eastward. At the beginning of 1945, Patton's units crossed the Saar and faced the last organized defenses of the Reich's western line. German resistance, although weakened by the loss of reserves and fuel, remained intense in numerous sectors. For Patton, every defended position, every local counterattack was a new confirmation of the German soldiers' tenacity and of his commander's ability to organize improvised defenses even under clearly unfavorable circumstances. In March 1945, the Third Army reached the Rhine River, the most important natural barrier before the heart of Germany. While other Allied formations consolidated bridgeheads in areas such as Remagen, Patton ordered a series of rapid crossings in the Oppenheim sector. The operation, carried out with light amphibious equipment and taking advantage of surprise, allowed the establishment of bridgeheads south of Mainz with less resistance than expected. Again, the emphasis was on speed and the immediate exploitation of success, following principles of maneuver warfare that he associated with the best traditions of the German school, but now applied by his own troops on Reich territory. As the Third Army forces advanced deeper into Germany, they began to encounter facilities of the Nazi concentration camp system. One of the first to come under Patton's jurisdiction was the Ohrdruf camp, a sub-camp of Buchenwald, discovered in April 1945. The conditions found there by the American troops had a profound impact on the Allied commanders. Patton personally visited the site, and his reaction, described in testimonies and diaries, was one of evident physical repulsion. Faced with this scene, he ordered that captured German officers and local civilians be brought to the camp to witness firsthand the consequences of the regime they had served or tolerated. For a man who had for years mentally separated military professionalism from the ideological content of Nazism, the concrete sight of an extermination and forced labor center posed a clear challenge. The German generals and officers he had admired for their competence now appeared directly or indirectly linked to a system of mass violence that exceeded any category of conventional war. Nevertheless, in his later comments, Patton continued to distinguish between levels of responsibility. He considered that many soldiers and junior officers had followed orders without full knowledge of the extent of the crimes and maintained a degree of respect for their behavior in combat. His judgment of senior commanders was more ambiguous. On one hand, he recognized their technical ability. On the other, he struggled to reconcile that ability with the reality of the discovered camps. The impact of Ohrdruf and other similar sites was, in any case, a turning point in his perception of the enemy, introducing a moral dimension that could not be ignored. Chapter 4: End of the War and Patton's Respectful Administration. After the end of combat in Europe, the Third Army transitioned from an offensive force to a tool of occupation and administration. By mid-1945, Patton assumed a dual role: commander of the Third Army and the highest military authority in Bavaria, the region most strongly associated with National Socialism within southern Germany. His new responsibilities had little to do with the rapid maneuvers and armored strikes that had defined his career. He had to ensure public order, manage millions of displaced persons, reorganize basic infrastructure, and implement Allied directives on demilitarization and the denazification of German society. General orders came from the European Theater headquarters and the U.S. political authority under President Harry S. Truman. Documents such as JCS Directive 1067 established that occupation forces should treat Germany not as a potential ally, but as a defeated country responsible for a war of aggression. It ordered the dismantling of its military potential, the prevention of Nazi structure reconstruction, and the removal from public office of those who had actively collaborated with the regime. Patton, accustomed to evaluating people and organizations in terms of military effectiveness, viewed the strictest interpretation of these orders with caution. In Bavaria, administrative reality collided directly with theoretical instructions. Most officials, judges, police officers, and municipal technicians had been members of the Nazi Party or affiliated organizations. Excluding all of them would, in practice, completely paralyze civil life. Patton considered this counterproductive. He needed trains to run, water to reach cities, and rationing offices to function. Therefore, he allowed numerous officials with Nazi pasts to remain in their positions or be quickly rehabilitated, provided they were not directly implicated in violent crimes. In his eyes, they were above all professionals necessary to maintain the basic structure of society. This attitude also extended to his dealings with Wehrmacht officers who were prisoners or interned. Patton frequently visited the camps where German generals and colonels were held, engaged them in conversations about campaigns, maneuvers, and tactical decisions, and interrogated them not only as defeated enemies, but as professional colleagues. Many of these officers came from the old Prussian military school, trained before the rise of Nazism, and shared with him a view of war as a technical art and a lifelong profession. This shared perspective allowed Patton to maintain a respectful and sometimes cordial tone with generals who had fought fiercely against his own troops. His distinction between professional soldier and Nazi politician became increasingly marked. Patton tended to see the Wehrmacht as essentially a military institution, only partially contaminated by the regime's ideology, and reserved his harshest condemnation for the SS and organizations directly involved in repression and genocide. This mental separation led him to argue that many military officers had joined the Nazi Party due to social pressure or to preserve their careers. Similarly to how in the United States officials and office holders affiliated with the Democratic or Republican Party for professional convenience. This analogy, which seemed to him a simple, pragmatic description, was interpreted in Washington and in the press as an intolerable trivialization of Nazism. The conflict intensified as U.S. civilians, journalists, and representatives of other agencies assumed positions in post-war administration. The U.S. military government office in Germany, under figures such as Lucius D. Clay, pushed for strict denazification criteria. Patton, however, prioritized speed in restoring order and the economy. He often overruled denazification commissions when he considered their actions excessively formalistic, reinstating officials whose competence he deemed indispensable. In memoranda and private conversations, he complained that Germany was being governed by theorists who did not understand the reality on the ground. Internal tensions quickly reached public attention. The US press reported Patton's statements and comments which, taken out of context, sounded like leniency toward former Nazis. Interviews in which he qualified the responsibility of certain officials or insisted that the true future danger was the Soviet Union were read as proof that he prioritized geopolitical considerations over punishment of the defeated regime. His years of professional respect toward German generals were, in the eyes of many, confused with political sympathies that he had never openly claimed. At the same time, Patton continued privately to express his admiration for the technical competence of many of these officers. In his diaries, he noted impressions of how certain German generals had organized defenses or withdrawals in the final months of the war, and he did not hesitate to describe them as great soldiers, even when fully aware that they had served a state responsible for mass crimes. His inability or unwillingness to fully integrate this moral dimension into his professional assessment was one of the most controversial aspects of his conduct in the immediate post-war period. During the summer of 1945, frictions with the Allied chain of command became more visible. Dwight D. Eisenhower, now Supreme Commander in occupied Europe, received constant reports on Patton's policy in Bavaria, his ambiguous statements, and his clashes with civilian authorities. Eisenhower, who appreciated his abilities as a field leader, also understood that the occupation phase required other qualities: political sensitivity, the ability to coordinate with allies, and strict adherence to directives issued at the highest level. Patton's repeated refusal to fully adapt to this new context increasingly weighed on deliberations regarding his future. The critical point came with a series of statements to journalists in September 1945. In one of these interviews, Patton reiterated the comparison between Nazi affiliation and membership in traditional American parties, stating that he saw no reason to remove all former party members from administration if they were technically competent and could not be charged with specific crimes. The publication of these words unleashed a wave of criticism in the press and Congress. For many observers, it sounded like an open defense of people who had supported the Third Reich's machinery. For Patton, it was simply the acknowledgement that a country could not be governed without relying on its administrative cadres, even if they were marked by the past. Under political pressure, Eisenhower decided he could not keep Patton in charge of Bavaria, or of a major operational force in the heart of Germany. The combination of his long-standing professional respect for German generals, his pragmatic attitude toward denazification, and his imprudent statements made him a difficult figure to maintain in a position of high political visibility. In October 1945, he was relieved of command of the Third Army and the military governorship of Bavaria, and assigned to command the 15th Army, which had a very different mission from what he associated with his professional identity. It was not a major combat force, but a structure largely tasked with collecting documentation, overseeing reports, and producing historical studies on the recently concluded war operations. The contrast with commanding an armored army in campaign was evident. Patton perceived the change as a covert demotion and did not make much effort to hide his resentment. In his private comments, he considered that he had been removed from the center of decision-making precisely at the moment when, in his view, a clear analysis of the new balance of forces in Europe was most necessary. This new balance, as he interpreted it, was above all marked by the weight of the Soviet Union on the continent. Since 1943, he had closely followed the Red Army's progress on the Eastern Front, its capacity to absorb massive losses and reorganize successive offensives, as well as the final deployment of Soviet forces in the heart of Central Europe. Now, with Germany defeated and divided into occupation zones, Patton viewed with concern that the border between Soviet and Western troops crossed the center of the continent, leaving Poland, the Baltic countries, and much of the Balkans under communist control. In this situation, his professional respect for German generals acquired a new dimension. They were no longer just former enemies admired for their competence, but also potential counterweights to Soviet power. In Bavaria, he had the opportunity to observe directly the behavior of Soviet troops in the border areas and to receive reports of looting, rape, and reprisals. For him, accustomed to judging armies by their internal discipline and by how they treated civilian populations, these reports confirmed a negative image of the Red Army, which he saw as a brutal and politically uncontrolled force, yet backed by a state with expansive ambitions. In contrast to this perception, the discipline and order of the former Wehrmacht seemed, retrospectively, a lesser evil from the standpoint of the European strategic balance. In his diaries and conversations during those months, Patton expressed the idea that, after the defeat of the Third Reich, the real problem was no longer Germany, but Soviet expansion. He believed that the policy of unconditional surrender had completely destroyed the German military structure, just when it could have been used as a barrier against Moscow. He argued that if part of the German forces had been maintained under Allied control, they could have been employed to contain the Soviet Union in the East. In that logic, the same Nazi generals he had admired on the battlefield became, in his strategic imagination, possible allies in a future war he saw as almost inevitable. This idea was not shared by most of the high command or the political authorities in the United States. For Washington, the immediate priority was to stabilize Europe, prevent economic collapse, and ensure the transition to democratic regimes in the western part of the continent. The recent memory of German aggression, the growing awareness of the regime's crimes, and public pressure made any talk of rearming Germany or reusing its generals in a hypothetical military coalition unthinkable. Patton, on the other hand, operated within a mental framework closer to 19th century power balances, where former enemies could become convenient allies against a greater threat. Within this framework, he continued to grant a privileged place to military professionalism as a criterion for judgment. When comparing German officers with Soviet commanders, he emphasized academic training, planning ability, and precision in operations. He saw in figures such as German marshals and generals a level of military culture that, in his perception, he did not find in Soviet commanders, whose authority he attributed more to party support than to professional merit. This comparison, though still based on a partial view and conditioned by ideological biases, reinforced his inclination to consider the Germans as potential partners in a Western defensive structure. In his comments about the future, Patton even suggested that war with the Soviet Union was only a matter of time, and that when that moment arrived, it would be a mistake not to make use of the experience of those who had fought for years on the Eastern Front. He argued that German generals knew better than anyone how the Red Army operated, its doctrine, strengths, and vulnerabilities. From his point of view, discarding that knowledge for purely political reasons amounted to unnecessarily weakening the Western position. These reflections relied on his long-standing admiration for the German military school, now projected onto a geopolitical scenario in which Nazism had been defeated, but competition among great powers remained alive. The problem was that Patton expressed these ideas with the same frankness and lack of filter that he had shown during the war. In conversations with journalists, officers, and visitors, he hinted at his conviction that the Soviets were occasional allies and future adversaries, and that the policy of conciliation toward Moscow was a mistake. In this context, some of his most commented-on phrases, in which he implied that the wrong enemy had been defeated, were interpreted as a retrospective delegitimization of the fight against Germany, and as a way of relativizing the Nazi threat compared to the communist danger. Although Patton did not express ideological sympathy for National Socialism, the way he framed strategic priorities gave the impression of minimizing the responsibilities of the German commanders. This emphasis on the Soviet threat was combined with his direct experience of the occupation. In Bavaria and other areas of southern Germany, he had encountered a population that, despite years of Nazi propaganda, now showed fear at the prospect of a Soviet advance westward. Patton interpreted this fear as a political factor that could be used to consolidate an anti-Bolshevik Germany within a Western bloc. His respect for the generals of the former Reich, whom he saw as representatives of a conservative and anti-communist tradition, fit with this implicit project of turning Germany into a bulwark against Moscow once the apparatus most committed to the Nazi regime had been removed. The institutional context in which he operated, however, was very different. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences had established frameworks for cooperation among the Allied powers, at least in appearance, and the occupation structures were organized on the basis of shared management of Germany. Patton's implicit proposals clashed with recent diplomatic commitments and with the desire to avoid, at least in the short term, an open rupture with Moscow. His insistence on speaking of a future conflict with the Soviets was therefore not only controversial from a moral point of view, but also untimely from the perspective of foreign policy. During his brief tenure at the head of the 15th Army, Patton alternated the routine work of reviewing operations with meetings, speeches, and trips within the occupation zone. In all these areas, his vision of the professional soldier as an almost autonomous figure with respect to politics continued to guide his behavior. He continued to distinguish between the absolute evil represented by structures such as the SS and the regime's security services, and the figure of the German general who, in his interpretation, had tried to do his military job within the framework of a dictatorial state. This distinction allowed him to continue admiring tactical and operational capabilities, while relegating the discussion of the moral responsibility of these commanders in the Nazi war machine to a secondary plane. The result was an increasingly pronounced perception of a disconnect between Patton and the official US line. While in Washington, a discourse was consolidating that emphasized the need to punish Nazi crimes, reorganize German society on democratic grounds, and maintain, at least publicly, some cooperation with the Soviet Union, Patton spoke of rearming Germany, using its generals as a shield against the East and considering communism the main threat. Chapter 5. Death and controversy regarding his position on Nazism. On December 9, 1945, Patton left his headquarters in Bad Nauheim to go on a hunting trip near Mannheim. He was traveling in the back of a service car alongside General Hobart Gay, with a driver at the wheel. On the outskirts of the city, the vehicle collided with a military truck that unexpectedly crossed the road. The impact was not spectacular in material terms, but Patton, who was not wearing a helmet or any special protection, suffered a severe blow to the head and a cervical fracture. While his companions were barely bruised, he was left virtually paralyzed from the neck down. After the accident, he was taken to the Heidelberg Military Hospital. There, he was diagnosed with a serious spinal injury, with compromised respiratory function and no control of his limbs. He remained hospitalized for 12 days, fully aware of the severity of his condition. He received visits from officers, family, and medical personnel, but the chances of recovery were minimal with the means available at the time. On December 21, 1945, George S. Patton died from complications resulting from the cervical injury, abruptly closing the career of one of the most outstanding commanders of the war and one of the most controversial figures of the immediate post-war period. His remains were buried in the American military cemetery in Hamm, Luxembourg, at some distance from the majority of the graves, in a position that symbolically highlighted his role as commander of the Third Army in the defense of the country during the Battle of the Bulge. From that moment on, the construction of his public figure was in the hands of memorials, biographies, journalistic articles, and later, film productions. Unlike other generals, Patton had left abundant personal documentation, diaries, letters to his wife, private notes, and statements collected by journalists. This material would serve as the basis for prolonged debates about his character, his political ideas, and, in particular, his admiration for German generals. In the decades following his death, the first biographies tended to emphasize above all his operational genius and leadership style. His role in the campaign in France, his maneuver in the Ardennes, and his ability to inspire offensive aggressiveness in his troops were highlighted. Within this framework, Patton's respect for the German soldier and command appeared as a form of professional recognition, praise for the adversary as a way to highlight, by contrast, the magnitude of one's own victories. Comments in which he described the German soldier as the best they had faced were cited as evidence of his intellectual honesty and refusal to underestimate the defeated enemy. Over time, with access to a larger number of documents, the focus became more complex. The publication of his diaries and personal papers revealed opinions much less nuanced about Germans in general. For example, they contained his judgment that the Germans are the only decent people in Europe, and that denazification was destroying the only semi-modern state on the continent so that Russia could swallow it. There were also explicit references to the idea that it was foolish to get rid of the smartest people in Germany just for having belonged to the Nazi Party, and comparisons between NSDAP membership and belonging to the Democratic or Republican Party as a practical requirement for holding positions in the United States. In the same documentary corpus, there are direct or indirect allusions to the phrase that would later become famous, "We fought the wrong enemy." The exact attribution of this quote has been a subject of historiographical discussion, but numerous sources agree that, at least in private, Patton expressed the idea that the main strategic threat was not defeated Germany, but the Soviet Union. In this context, his respect for German generals took on more controversial overtones. It was no longer just professional admiration for their tactical ability, but also the temptation to see them as potential allies in a future confrontation with communism. Later studies on denazification and the American occupation policy in Germany have situated Patton's positions within a broader debate. Many Allied officers shared concerns about the lack of administrative personnel uncontaminated by Nazism and the need to keep a devastated state functioning. However, most eventually accepted the logic of a partial purge, combined with the creation of new democratic structures. Patton, on the other hand, remained closer to a corporate view of society, in which the continuity of administrative and military elites was justified by their technical competence, even when they had served a criminal regime. This difference in approach explains much of the tension between him and Eisenhower and the US civilian authorities. From the 1970s onwards, Patton's public image received a decisive boost with the release of the film Patton, starring George C. Scott. The movie presented a charismatic, aggressive, unpredictable general, deeply convinced of his historical destiny. His relationship with German generals appeared mainly as a duel of military talents, especially in Africa and Western Europe, without delving deeply into the political dimension of his admiration or his post-war opinions. This portrayal contributed to consolidating in the popular imagination the figure of the controversial military genius, but left in the background the moral and political implications of his judgments about the enemy. More recent historiography has tended to offer a more critical view. On the one hand, Patton's operational ability is acknowledged, as well as the fact that German commanders themselves, in interrogations and memoirs, considered him one of the most dangerous adversaries on the Western Front. On the other hand, it is emphasized that his admiration for Nazi generals was rooted in a military culture that prioritized battlefield performance over ethical reflection and tended to radically separate the profession of arms from political responsibility. In light of current knowledge about the Wehrmacht's involvement in war crimes and brutal occupation policies, that separation appears increasingly difficult to sustain. Other studies have explored the ideological dimensions of his views. His anti-Semitism has been pointed out, visible in letters and notes concerning Jewish survivors in displaced persons camps under his jurisdiction, as well as his tendency to minimize the specific nature of Nazism by comparing it to partisan disputes in the United States. This line of analysis considers that his respect for German generals cannot be understood solely as technical admiration, but is tinged with social prejudices and with a hierarchical and authoritarian vision of political order. Did George S. Patton really say, "We fought the wrong enemy"? This exact quote has never been documented, but he never hid his feelings toward communism. He caused many problems in the post-war period by refusing to denazify many positions in local governments, which angered the Allies, especially Russia and France. He never trusted the Soviets and was said to have stated that the best course would be to rearm the Germans immediately in order eventually to confront the Russians. In any case, Patton was saying out loud what many were thinking in private, but he did so too early. By 1947 to 1948, most people already believed that conflict with the Soviets was inevitable. In 1945, when Patton was removed from his command because of some of his comments, there were still those who believed that the post-war world might be relatively peaceful and that there would be cooperation between East and West. Churchill himself, a well-known anti-communist, had instructed his military planners to draw up plans for what a war with the Soviets might look like between 1945 and 1946, and the results were discouraging. Operation Unthinkable revealed that the Western Allies had little hope of maintaining a significant presence on the continent, much less of pushing the Soviets back into Russia. Moreover, the plan envisioned the use of several atomic bombs that did not yet exist and relied heavily on US air supremacy to counter the overwhelming Soviet advantage in infantry and tanks. To expand on this, Patton was a fierce anti-Semite. His hatred of communism was not only a criticism of the ideology, but also of Russians and Slavs in general, going so far as to call them semi-Asiatic, which, as many know, was an insult used by the Nazis to refer to Eastern Europeans and to justify their view of them as subhuman. In fact, he was even reprimanded by Eisenhower because of the deplorable conditions of Jews and other prisoners in newly liberated Nazi concentration camps under his jurisdiction. Below are some excerpts. Patton on denazification in Bavaria. Under our rules, which require the complete denazification of Germany, we must eliminate all those who have ever expressed themselves in any way as Nazis or paid dues to the party. It is very evident that anyone who had been in business, regardless of their real feelings, had to say they were a Nazi and pay the dues. The only young people who were not Nazis came out of the internment camps and therefore are Jews or communists. We are certainly in a difficult position as far as obtaining public officials is concerned. Patton's anti-Semitism, according to his own diaries, "The clamor against me is only the means by which the Jews and the communists are trying with good success to implement further dismemberment of Germany." There is a very evident Semitic influence in the press. They are trying to do two things. First, to implement communism, and second, to make sure that all businessmen of German descent and non-Jewish background are thrown out of their jobs. Some comments on Patton. To his discredit, Patton reserved a blatant contempt for the miserable Jewish survivors of the Nazi camps, who in his opinion did not regain their humanity as quickly as other groups. The Jews, Patton said, preferred to live in filth and misery, even though his army had provided them with sanitary facilities, clothing, adequate meals, etc. In his diary, he compared them to subhuman animals and doubted that they would ever again be fit to reintegrate into society. In any case, to return to the main point, these views, as noted, made Patton unpopular in his post-war role, and as military governor of Bavaria, he quickly ran into trouble when the perception that the denazification process under his command was highly deficient rapidly took hold. Reporters soon hounded him about the retention of former Nazi officials in administrative positions. A more intelligent response emphasizing pragmatic necessity might have salvaged the situation, but he quickly worsened the problem with his reply, captured, as I recall, in the 1970 biopic, which compared being a member of the Nazi Party to being a Democrat or a Republican in the United States. Of course, it must be emphasized that none of this was a simple misunderstanding. In his diary, Patton was quite explicit about what he was doing and thinking when he wrote, "Under our rules, which require the complete denazification of Germany, we must eliminate all those who have ever expressed themselves in any way as Nazis or paid dues to the party. It is very evident that anyone who had been in business, regardless of their real feelings, had to say they were a Nazi and pay the dues. The only young people who were not Nazis came out of the internment camps and therefore are Jews or communists. We are certainly in a difficult position as far as obtaining public officials is concerned." The press, of course, could not see such writings, but they were on the right track nonetheless and attacked him further, and Eisenhower exploded at his old friend George. The final result was that Patton was shunted off to a fictitious command of the 15th Army, a formation that barely existed for military historians. In private, Patton's prejudices were plainly visible. In another letter to his wife, venting about the problems he himself had caused, his thinking became fully conspiratorial.